culture is constantly speaking to our kids about sex and sexuality. Sadly, the cultural narrative teaches kids sexual beliefs and behaviors that are anything but biblical. How can we have healthy conversations with our kids about God's design for sex and sexuality? Are there any sexual non-negotiables that we should be emphasizing when we talk to our kids about sex and sexuality? We'll be answering these questions and talking about much more on this debut episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Hey everybody, Walt Mueller here at CPYU, and we are very excited about this first edition of our new podcast, Youth Culture Matters. This is going to be a great time when we get together periodically and just talk about things that are happening in youth culture. And one of the things that I'm most excited about is I don't have to do this alone. Jason Soshenik, who's on associate staff with CPYU and runs Project 619, helping us with our sexual integrity initiative, is going to be co-hosting rather regularly. So I'm pretty excited about that. Jason, welcome.
It's great to be here, Walt. I'm really excited for us to be able to partner on this endeavor.
And what's really fun about this, Jason, is that we've known each other for how many years now?
Oh.
It's not a quiz. Just
maybe 5, 10. It's been a long time.
Yeah, right, 5, 10. That's pretty close. And basically we met because you were involved in promoting sexual integrity. We were involved in that as well.
I was.
And we got to know each other. And what's great about our relationship, this is what I like, and I think folks will be able to understand this as they start to listen to us talk back and forth, is that I am from one generation and you're from another. I'm a baby boomer. You hassle me about that all the time. What are you?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I sit between millennial and Gen X.
Okay,
so
all right.
I'm a bridger in some ways.
Right. So our conversations are always filled with grace, but we don't always agree. And as we analyze things, that's what makes it fun. But for the most part, we agree. So that's a neat thing.
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So here's what we're going to be doing in this podcast. And when I say this podcast, I'm talking about not only today, but here on out, is we're going to spend some time talking together about youth culture. We'll start with a segment on some of the latest news, things that are happening out there in the world of youth culture, trying to not just communicate what's happening, but how to begin to respond, things that we think are going to be helpful for parents, for youth workers, for grandparents, educators, anybody who cares about kids. We keep all those groups in mind. And then also we'll have a longer segment towards the end where we talk about a particular youth culture matter. And today we're going to be talking about some non-negotiables. In fact, we titled it 5 non-negotiables that we need to keep in mind when we're talking to kids about sex and sexuality. And certainly those are conversations we need to have. But as always, we want to kick off with some of the news, some of the things that are happening, some of the trends that we need to be concerned about. And I've asked Jason to bring some things. I brought some things as well. Very quickly, hey, the first one is this. And this, Jason, was rather alarming to me, but I think it plays into, how kids are developmentally, some of the risk-taking and impulsivity that's part of teenage development. The brain's not fully formed until about the age of 24, 25 years old. So kids will do crazy things. You combine that with some of the pressure that's out there regarding substance abuse, and you get this story about 2 teenage boys in Tennessee who lost their lives recently after they drank a concoction that is known as Dew-Shine. Now, that's not to be confused with the actual soft drink from the Mountain Dew Company called Dew-Shine, but it is a drink that combines Mountain Dew, the soda, the soda pop, with methanol-based racing fuel. Had you heard about this at all, or?
I had not until this article came out and started talking about it. I've always been aware of how these things change from one to the next teen, but I had not known of this concoction until
Yeah,
now.
and this is what happens. Kids, they're trying to escape or take some risks or try something new, and they sniff, they snort, they ingest, they inject all kinds of different substances trying to get high. Well, so these two teenagers, I think 16 years old, went to a party, drank this mixture of Mountain Dew and methanol-based racing fuel, thinking they would get the same effects from the methanol-based racing fuel as they would get from alcohol, but it was highly toxic. What the Center for Disease Control and Prevention is now saying is that what they died from is methanol poisoning, which may not show for 1 to 72 hours afterwards, after ingesting this.
So crazy.
And the symptoms parents should look for are things like nausea, vomiting, an inability to move your muscles, hallucinations, blindness, and death. And what the CDC is telling us is that as little as 2 tablespoons of methanol can be deadly to a child, and 2 to 8 ounces of methanol can be deadly for an adult. So we're saying, hey, parents be aware of this, youth workers be aware of this. These are not easy things to talk about, but we need to talk about these things with our kids and warn them about the dangers. And one of the things we always say, Jason, here at CPYU is that giving them information is not the same as giving them permission. I think the information needs to be couched in strong moral parameters, and we talk about the rightness or the wrongness, the safety or the danger of certain behaviors. So this is certainly one of those things. So you're a parent, how would I'm guessing, is this the kind of thing you would talk to your kids about?
Yeah, I think as a parent, we have to be aware of what is going on in the world around us. I think that these can actually be opportunities for us to be able to engage in conversation with our son and daughter. Whenever news events like this happen, I think it's just another opportunity for us to engage in conversations around substance abuse. And substance abuse isn't what we might sometimes just think alcohol or drugs. It can be concoctions that friends make. And so being aware and being able to know some of these things both as a parent, but then I think good communication around these topics can actually provide educational opportunities for us to engage with our son or our daughter. So I think that just being aware of this is really important. One of the other things that's coming out in the news, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I know that you've talked about this often, is the question around how safe is youth football. Recently, there was an article that talked about how when the movie Concussion came out, there was a lot of conversation around youth and some of the things that are happening with regards to some of the effects of the sports that they're now playing. And one of the things, and even the article cites, it says certainly hitting your brain doesn't do anyone any good, but there have been a lot of changes made to the youth football level. And I think that one of the conversations that I always love hearing from you, Walt, is what is happening with regards to youth and football and the structure of it, and especially around this conversation of CTE, which I know that you've done some work on as well. So I'm really curious as students, teens become more specialized in their sports, how prominent these concussions in football or other sports are going to be for youth. And as a parent, how do we engage that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. And, I put something up on Facebook a few weeks ago where I just said, hey, I don't know where this is going to go. And it was after the movie Concussion came out. And you're right. I've been checking into this CTE, which is actually the initials for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is what happens to the brain as a result of several concussive blows over the course of time. And they're seeing that in a lot of actually, they can't diagnose it when someone's living. It's always after death, and it's usually that's what kills people. And sometimes what kills them or what drives them to kill themselves after they become especially violent or their personality changes is what is this emerging field of knowledge about CTE. And there are a lot of physicians that are starting to look at this. But my concern with it is that this it's real. And it is probably the thing we need to talk about more than anything else related to youth sports, because it can change a person's life not just in the now, but forever. That seems to be what we're learning, and the pushback is coming, by the way, from professional, the NFL, the professional league, because they don't really, I believe, want to deal with it. And part of what I put up on Facebook was, I think the face of football is going to change in 5 years, whether that's at the professional level or at younger levels. And I think it's fully possible that we're going to start to see school districts dropping their football programs because of litigation and legal matters. In other words, the more that's known about this, the more pushback there's going to be at the local level. So the story you're citing came on the heels of Ken Stabler, a quarterback for the Oakland Raiders who died a little while ago. They examined his brain. Yes, he had CTE, and they're seeing this in a lot of deceased football players. That then sparked some more talk about this, and the East Texas Boys and Girls Club of the Big Pines voted to drop tackle football. And the leader, a spokesperson for them, said this: "We cannot be there for the children when we are engaging in an activity with these kind of documented results." So the club will continue football, but in non-contact 7-on-7 drills rather than full tackle drills. What's interesting about this is that some of the science that's pushing back that folks in the NFL are citing is saying that, look, at the level of youth football, there's 100 or less cranial impacts a season, so the exposure to potential injury isn't really that much of a risk or one that we should be that concerned about. I would say yes, because you've got kids, little children, and even teenagers with developing brains. When you get to the high school level, players, the research says players have 600 to 800 impacts per season to the head, and then by the time they get to the college level, more than 1,000. I don't know what that number is in the pro ranks, but certainly it's one that we need to be concerned about. So, go ahead.
Well, one of the interesting things that's happening, though, too, you mentioned in 5 years youth sports might change, or they'll football specifically might not be in the schools, and I think that the NFL will be responsible for some of this change, because the NFL now has its own Pop Warner leagues, has its own football leagues, has their own leagues that then obviously then they influence rules and structure and things of that sort. So I'm curious how that's going to play out. I would actually be curious, as someone that's raised several children, and who played sports. How would you handle this now, knowing what you know with regards to football? And I might even include sports like soccer. I know that sometimes that's not the most favorite sport of some people.
Right, the ball hits you in the head. Right,
yeah,
and my boys were lacrosse players as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's lots of blows there. For the guys that wear helmets, and then my girls were field hockey and soccer players. And with field hockey, boy, that's the hardest ball out there. And we did have a concussion with one of them who took a shot straight in the forehead. So yeah, it's a real thing. That's a good question. And I'll just say, with our oldest son, Josh, who wound up playing football and lacrosse through high school and then was a lacrosse player in college, we did make a decision early on that even though he had a desire to play football in elementary school, we did not let him play. Now, part of that was due to the fact that I had observed youth football and the way that the behavior that went on the sidelines with the coaches, the kinds of way they pressured the kids. I thought he was too young. Maybe later. We were concerned about injury as well. We didn't think about head injury. Most of our injury concerns were about, broken arms, broken legs. Because here's the problem. This is the way it always happened. And I think it still does at some level, although high schools now have, my daughter-in-law, Josh, actually married an athletic trainer. They have protocols now, much like the NFL, where if you take a blow to the head, you're out of the game. You will be evaluated. Our concerns back then were that our kids would take blows to the head, and coaches and parents would say, shake it off, get back in there. And we know now we can't do that.
I remember that.
We kept him out until 8th grade to play football. And some of the concern there is, well, why are you doing that? He's going to be behind. Well, he wasn't behind. He caught up. He did well. And, I think he was spared opportunities for injury, certainly to his arms, his legs, his ribs, the rest of his body. We weren't thinking especially about the head. But now I think parents need to think about that. And so what I'm going to say is this, as we think about this, and that is that parents need to be aware this. The health of your child is there. And we have been called by God to be stewards of our bodies, and kids are developing and growing. So I just want to say, keep watching this. And youth workers, this is something you need to track with as well. We're going to deal with this here at CPYU, and certainly in future podcasts, we'll devote podcasts to this and get some experts on here, but it's something to watch. I want to say as well, Jason, just to make a switch, that when we talk about violence, we're not just talking about sports. But one of the things that we've talked about here through our Sexual Integrity Initiative, and we've started to track with more, is this culture of sexual violence that exists in our culture. Talk a little bit about that in terms of some of the things we're learning. We're hearing about campus rape. That's getting, when we talk about campus, college campus, university campus, and the culture of rape there. But talk about sexual violence and how that extends beyond the college campus.
Yeah, well, what we're finding is that sexual violence, what we see in the media, usually is just related to college campuses. But what we're seeing at a high school and even middle school level is this playing itself out. Why is that? Well, it's what we see in the culture. One might be able to argue the influence of pornography and how that's having an impact.
So in other words, the cultural narrative is saying to kids, this is what you do. And this is what it means to be human, and this is what it means to act out your sexuality.
I think that's exactly it. One of the things that we've had to add to our public school presentation is sexual coercion. We 5 years ago really didn't need to have that. I think I was seeing early signs of that when we were in the public schools then, but we don't have a choice any longer. We have to speak on dating violence. We have to speak on sexual coercion, because it's normalized. Our culture has moved to such a place that teens in the high school actually don't understand or recognize that no means no.
Yeah. Hey, let me interrupt you there and just ask you a question, just to give some context, because you're talking about these things in the public schools. What? Just give us a little bit of background on what you do with Project 619 and your work in public schools. So set the context for people who are listening as we talk about sexual coercion in the public schools.
Yeah, so sexual coercion in the schools, the reason we know about it as a ministry, Project 619, our heart is speaking on sexual integrity. And so we do that both in churches and schools, and we also work with families. And the work that we specifically do in the schools is we have a 4-day presentation called Life Up Close that brings us into the context, the human growth and development section that schools offer. And for instance, in Washington State, it's ninth grade. Ninth grade tends to be the time where you get the largest chunk of human growth and development. It's actually one of the last times that you get human growth and development. So we're granted 4 days in the classroom. And so we talk everything from choice, marriage, to media discernment, to then finally on the last day talking about healthy relationship. And the reality that we find is that many have never had conversations around relationship. The way that they do relationship and they label as healthy typically is unhealthy. So there needs to be someone like ourselves that go in and talk about what they're believing is just not real. And the way we actually do it is we don't just tell them, we want to engage with them. And so the presentation really draws out as much as we give information.
And what are you saying about sexual coercion then?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're trying to communicate is that no means no. That when you're forcing your desire upon someone else and it's not their desire, then their desire, the person who you're trying to influence, wins out. Their answer, their response is the one that we have to honor. And that's just not something that we or many of these teens that we work with have ever known, because most of what they watch, most of what they see, when someone says no, it's really just foreplay. And this is not foreplay. When someone says no, we've got to respect their response.
Now you're talking about, I was just going to say, you're talking about human growth and development, where you are ninth grade, and so you have access to the schools then. But what we're finding with sexual coercion, and certainly with values and attitudes that influence behavior sexually, kids are getting an education at a much younger age. And so some of the news reports are coming out talking about sexual coercion as early as elementary school, and things happening in the school building.
That's right. And I would even argue some of the conversation that we have around bullying is exactly that. It's just sexual coercion. We have multiple school districts that are asking us to come in and actually speak on these things at a younger and younger age. And that was never the case 5, 7, 8 years ago. And because of now the normalization of these things, we're being asked to come in and speak younger and younger.
Yeah. Now this is interesting. Well, go ahead.
No. What were you gonna say?
Well, I've been reading a very interesting book by a guy named Jonathan Grant. The book is called Divine Sex, which is a difficult book to read on an airplane because people look at the title and wonder what kind of pervert you are. But I've been reading
Welcome to my entire life.
Yeah, so I've been reading it on airplanes. The subtitle of the book is A Compelling Vision for Christian Relationships in a Hypersexualized Age. And what I love about what Jonathan Grant's doing in this book is he's talking about the underlying attitudes and cultural shifts that have fed this culture of hypersexualization, including this culture of sexual entitlement. And he talks about the history of expressive individualism in our culture, where it's all about me and I can do whatever I want whenever I want, and that certainly is transferred over into the area of sexuality. So real quickly, you're talking about having these conversations. These are conversations that, yes, it's good they're happening in the school, but we have to be having these with our kids in the home.
Yes, we do.
And in the youth group. So just give us a couple of suggestions for parents and for youth workers and others on how to make that happen. What have you learned about how to make that happen? A couple of suggestions.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that we can do is just take what's going on in the news and then use those as opportunities to speak our value. That's
Teachable
probably
moments.
The quickest, easiest. Yes, very much so. I think that sometimes we miss those opportunities because we want to shy away from rather than step into. And so I think that's a really important thing. I also think with regard to this one subject, I think it's not just speaking our value on sex, it's also speaking our value on relationship. So how do we do relationship? What as a family do we really believe about how we step into relationship? And a lot of times we fail to remember that how we teach relationship then influences the way that our sons and daughters might date, and how they go forth and allow for those relationships to form. So I think that those two aspects are really key. There are multiple others, of course, but I just think that communication is one of the most important things. I always say we often forget as parents that our voice matters, that statistically what's shown is teens will actually wait longer when they have a parent or parents that are actually speaking their value. And we sometimes fail to remember that because we think, peers have more influence or the media has more influence. But actually it's parents. Parents have more influence, and it's simply just communicating that value.
And that's the way God set it up to be. And so we need to remember that. I often say that the culture is catechizing, nurturing, socializing our kids 24/7 into an understanding of their sexuality and how to practice their sexuality, how to live out their sexuality. But God made us for relationships with our kids. God made us as parents and as the church community to come together, to use the metaphor of the village. It takes a village to come together. And I think we need to do that. We must be diligent about that in today's world. And that's a good segue into what we're going to talk about next. After we take a break, we want to talk about what are some non-negotiables, 5 non-negotiables to be specific, that we need to incorporate into our discussions with our kids when it comes to talking to them about sexuality. So we'll be right back after a break to talk about these non-negotiables. Here at the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, we want to help you stay up to date on today's youth culture. One of the tools we've developed to keep you current is our weekly Youth Culture e-update. Delivered to you by email, our Youth Culture e-update comes to you in a format that allows you to easily scroll through and quickly choose those stories and resources that will be most helpful to you in your particular setting. To sign up for this free resource, go to our website at cpyu.org, scroll down to the bottom of the page, and enter your email address in the tab marked e-update sign up. It's that simple. Welcome back, everybody, to this first podcast, this first episode of Youth Culture Matters, a brand new podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. I'm Walt Mueller. And Jason Sochanek from Project 619 is here joining us. We're talking today now about sexuality and 5 non-negotiables when it comes to talking to kids about sex and sexuality. Jason, we said that, the culture is catechizing our kids, talking to our kids 24/7 through social media and internet access about sexuality. Certainly, the media is full of messages about sexuality. I often say when I'm talking to parents that the script or the cultural narrative is basically, when it comes to sex and sexuality, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want, however you want, with whomever you want. I mean, just all those things come together. There's no borders, there's no boundaries. And so you and I have talked quite a bit about
extensively.
Yeah, how do we communicate this to our kids? Now, one of the things, I'll just share this story real quick, is we've actually done an event together called what do we call it? Sexual Jumpstart, which is
Sexual Jumpstart. Oh,
right,
yes.
Which is a great name you came up with. I mean, that certainly draws people in. And what we do is we come together with teenagers and parents. Our goal for the night is to jumpstart the conversations that should be happening between parents and their teens that are difficult for both sides to make happen. So we figure if we can start the conversation, they can leave and have the conversation. So how this works is we'll gather at a location and we'll meet with them together for about 5 or 10 minutes, tell them what to expect, and then you go off with the students, you talk about sexuality, I go off with the parents, I talk about what the culture's teaching them about sexuality, and then how we need to push back. Then we bring them back together for Q&A, which is
fun.
really, it's a fun time. I mean, the questions we get are great, but then we send them off with an assignment for what to talk about that night or in the next 24 hours, again, giving them this jump start. One little anecdote, and I laugh at this every time I think about it, was the time we were in that church and we were setting up. My wife was there with us.
We were in Central Washington.
Yeah, we were in Central Washington State, and we're setting up out there, and they had put up these posters all over the church, Sexual Jump Start this Wednesday night. And a group of senior citizens had been there during the afternoon, and so as we were setting up, they were leaving. And a couple that had to be in their mid-80s, maybe older, I don't know, but they shuffled past, and the guy stops and he walks up to the door and he looks at the door and he's staring at it, and then he points at it and he turns to his wife and he goes, "Look at this, Sexual Jumpstart." Then he looks at her and says, "That's what we need." And immediately she grabbed his arm and said, "We're going home." But everybody needs to talk about these things. So the question now is, how do we talk about it? And one of the things I love, the first non-negotiable that I'm thinking about here, and this is not going to be exhaustive at all.
Not at all.
There's other non-negotiables.
We've got a very
We're going
short
to give you
time.
5, right. But the first one that I think of is one that we've talked about, and that is pushing back on the way that so many of us learned in the church and from our parents about sexuality, that God's view on sexuality was a big no, and consequently we were told don't do it, and now from here on out don't talk about it. And so that frames sexuality in such negative ways. So how do you like to talk about it? What's the terminology you use?
Well, I think that we've got to label how we speak about this around what God is for rather than what God is against. I was just at a church meeting just a few nights ago where a parent asked the question, how do we speak about this with our son or daughter without it being framed in shame? And I think that if we can find ways, because I believe Scripture actually does speak of ways to speak about what God is for rather than what God is against. And I think that we see that very specifically in the story that's played out. You and I both talk about God's story, the 4-part story that we were a part of, that we often miss out on. So often the conversations around sex start with the fall, sin. So that's
right.
Where we
and the
get
4 parts, just to tell people what those are. You
Yes.
read this from Genesis to Revelation. Chapter 1, creation, the first couple chapters of Genesis. Chapter 2, the fall. When we get to Genesis 3:6, we rebel, everything comes undone. All those things that God created, including sexuality, that he said are good. He declared those things as good, gave it to us as a gift.
Very good, actually.
Yeah, very good. Chapter 3.
Very good.
Chapter 3 would be redemption, which happens very quickly after Genesis 3:6, when God pronounces the curse and it foretells of the coming of Christ. That one who will, as he's addressing the serpent, addressing the enemy, the Satan, the one who will you'll bruise his heel, he will crush your head. And then chapter 4 is what we read about in the latter verses of the book of Revelation, when the new heaven and the new earth come in, everything's restored. And so what was supposed to be the shalom, the flourishing that existed in the garden now exists. So that's the 4-part story. So go ahead.
Well, most definitely. And I think that so often we miss, if we only start with Genesis 3, the fall, what ends up happening is a lot of our language comes out of that. A lot of the way that we dive into this conversation comes out of that. So it's more about what we're against rather than what we're for. I think the view then starts with, and which then dictates how we see others, is one of sin rather than image of God. But if we're using the 4-part story, it starts in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and so we get this wonderful revelation of God's intent. We get to see image of God, and we get to celebrate that. I think it's in that then, as we looked at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we see intimacy, we see celebration, we see the beauty, we see the mystery, we see desire, we see procreation, pleasure, protection, all of these things coming together in the very first 2 chapters. I always say we were sexual before we were sinful. And that is not often what we talk about. And that I think has a huge impact on those in the church, and I think even outside of the church. What I've found is as we dive into this conversation and really start with God's intent, the creation, it really has an impact then on how others engage in this conversation moving forward.
Yeah.
And that is one of the most wonderful things.
Yeah, and I was going to say, in all my years of doing youth ministry, what I've heard, not only from students in the church, but even more so from people, in the culture at large, is there are misconceptions that, many people believe God doesn't have anything to say about sex. And I've been in Bible studies with students who have very little, if no biblical knowledge at all. You tell them that God does talk about sex, and they go, where? And you tell them about a book like Song of Solomon, and they just want to turn there right away, and they're
which
digesting
should come
that,
with a parental advisory. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got people who think, A, God, the first group is that they don't think God says anything about sex, and then B, you have this group where they think, God talks about sex, but it's all in negative ways. They've never read the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, and they believe that the passages in the New Testament that would tell us to avoid sexual immorality, they would reduce that to avoid sex, and that's not the case at all. So we want to start with what God is for and frame it in the Genesis narrative, what God gave us, this wonderful gift of sex, and we'll unpack that more in a little bit here. But we want to start with that, what God is for rather than what God is against. So the second non-negotiable is this, and I would state it this way, that we need to choose our words carefully. Now, certainly, we want to talk to kids about sex in age-appropriate ways, but what we're talking about here specifically is not in talking about the mechanics of sexuality, but rather kind of the overarching, ethos of how we talk. And the ways that people have done that historically in the church and in youth ministry is talking about sexual purity, where you and I would argue that we need to not talk so much about sexual purity, but the way we talk about it would be couched in terms of sexual integrity. Talk about that a little bit. What's the difference?
I think there's a few ways that we talk about sex in the church, specifically about waiting. And I think one is abstinence, one's purity. And I'm seeing more and more individuals use sexual integrity. As a ministry, that's the one that we've chosen. That's the one that you and I have chosen to engage in. I think with abstinence, we tend to focus only on the genitalia. We don't move into other aspects. We really are just responding to what the culture is defining as sex. I think with purity, we make it more about a moment where you put on a ring or something happens. We forget about the heart condition, although I think that some have a desire for that to be a part of what is in the conversation. I don't know if that always gets translated in all the conversations around purity. And then the aspect of sexual integrity, and why I love it so much, is it has to do with the entire person. It doesn't have to do with just one part of your body, your genitalia. It actually has to do with all of us, right? Integrity comes from the word, the aspect of it is wholeness, right? The whole person. And when you speak about the whole person, us being made in the image of God, what it does is it challenges us to live in obedience to the one that created us. And that is what I really love about sexual integrity, is that really it's about us walking in obedience with the one who created us, the one whom we have a relationship with, which is Jesus. And that being the place where we find our identity. And as that becomes our identity, then what we recognize, because we are loved, we choose to walk in love with the way that we respond to the world around us. And I think that's really important. I don't know what you would like to be able to add to that, but I know that we have had some wonderful conversations around the importance of sexual integrity.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, purity is a great word. And when I think about forgiveness of sin and being washed, and made new, the word purity is often used. So, why would we push back on that? And I think part of our understanding of that word is that it's a good word, but maybe it's not the best word to use in this context. So, for example, we've had conversations about metaphors. And the metaphors we use to communicate with kids about sexuality and remaining, quote-unquote, sexually pure. And one of the people that you talk about is Elizabeth Smart, who was kidnapped at a young age, sexually abused. And she talks about that using one of the metaphors that we very often use in the world of youth ministry or parenting that really probably isn't the best metaphor. And I think, well, explain that. That's, about...
Yeah, well, she, if you don't remember her story, abducted at a young age, forced into an abusive relationship, obviously, and then was found. And what she had said several years ago at an event at John Hopkins University was that she had been told that having sex was a lot like being chewed up, like a piece of gum. And that she felt like she was that piece of gum, that once you have that piece of gum, you don't want it to be chewed up again. And I'm kind of destroying the analogy, but it's the idea of we want to protect ourselves, and sex is really important. You can only have it once, and once you have already had it, no one else wants to have sex with you. And the analogy was around gum. And she said that she felt like she was that piece of gum that had been chewed up, and that because she was that piece of gum, she thought, who else would ever want to have a piece of me? Who else would ever want to be in relationship with me? And I just, my heart breaks when I hear those analogies, because I think we've all done it. We've all had it. And the heart behind them is we want students to understand, we want teens to understand that there is something precious about their sexuality. There's something precious about this gift. But we have to not just think about the student that we're speaking to then, we have to think about them when they're 25, and how is that analogy going to have an impact based upon all the life experiences that they're going to have when they get to 25. And I think that the analogies, the illustrations, all of those things play into how we speak about this. That's why I always say language has power.
Right.
And Scripture, I think, does a wonderful job of this. What I love so much about both the Hebrew and the Greek and the way that the conversations around sex and even more importantly relationship are shared, there's context and meaning, and that doesn't just sit with someone for when they're 15, but also when they're 25 and when they're 35 and when they're 45.
Right. So I can be a 15-year-old girl or boy right now. I can hear you speaking as my youth pastor in front of the room, or sitting across the table with my parent having one of these very serious conversations. You use that metaphor, I'm sexually pure, I have not been sexually active, but then I compromise 5, 6, 7 years down the road, and there's numerous reasons why that, including our brokenness and our bent towards sin. And now I remember that metaphor, and I think there's no hope for me. God's grace is not big enough for this. And certainly we don't want to cheapen grace, but at the same time, your point is, and I agree, by changing the language in what seems to be a subtle way, you're actually changing the conversation in some powerful ways and getting people who have a sexual history to think differently about God's forgiveness and what it means to the glory of God with their sexuality. I'll point people to one of our websites. We actually started a website off our CPYU.org website, our Sexual Integrity Initiative site, sexualintegrityinitiative.com, and we'll, on the podcast page, include a link to this particular handout. But that site, as all of our sites are just packed full of free downloads. And the one that you've written, which addresses this more in-depth than what we've talked about here, is a parent's primer on sexual integrity. So we'll include a link to that, and that will be a helpful thing for youth workers and parents to access. Let's move on to the third one here and hit this rather quickly. The third non-negotiable, the third of the five when it comes to talking to kids about sex and sexuality, and we would say that this is our need to debunk media's lies. We hit on this earlier, and we said that, number one, the culture is teaching our kids through media, certainly music, video, film, the books that kids are reading, pornography, all these other things. And rather than just saying stay away from those things, what we would say is we don't tell kids to go to those things, but when they encounter them, we want to first, if we're aware that they're encountering those, use them as teachable moments to contrast the cultural narrative and script on sexuality with a biblical script and narrative on sexuality. We want to take advantage of those things. And then secondly, we want to teach our kids skills for life and media evaluation, where they're now able to look at these things and discern for themselves based on God's order and design for sexuality and what truth is in the scriptures, discern for themselves truth from error. And so, a couple of the things that we've done at CPYU is we've created this 3D guide for media evaluation. We'll include a link to that, but that's a little tool where you get kids to think about the worldviews that are being promoted in the media piece, and then push back with biblical understanding. We've talked about advertisements. We've got a handout on our website called The Simple Seven, which are questions that parents and youth workers can train kids to filter every ad they encounter through, and certainly with sexuality or sex being something that's sold through advertising and used to sell product, we want kids to be able to pick up on that as well. I mean, there's an ambient sexuality out there in the media that we've got to get our kids to see and push back on. So use those things as teachable moments rather than as something to run from, just run from.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you pointed out was being able to take the script that culture gives and then compare it to the biblical script. My only fear sometimes is that we're not fully aware of the cultural script because maybe we shy away from, or we're just unaware. And I also wonder how aware we are of the biblical script. There are a lot of individuals that I have conversations with that are afraid to dive into Scripture because they're not exactly sure where it says don't have sex, and or sex is this wonderful gift but save it for marriage, or any one of these things. And I think that there has to be work that's done in understanding what's in Scripture, but also with what's happening in the culture. The culture is telling us a lot of lies around sex. If you speak to a teen or you speak to a young adult, what you find is they're going to say there's no consequences. That goes back to what we were talking about earlier in this podcast. No means yes. Instant gratification. No waiting is needed. And we even see a larger segment of individuals in the church, teens and young adults, that have walked away from a historical Christian sexual ethic. And I think it's because we've not offered a consistent sexual ethic in our own churches. And some of that's from a misunderstanding of the biblical script. It's not been spoken at all. And I think that's allowed for the lies that we see in our culture to then impact the way that we talk about it in the church. One example is around the definition of sex. I think that the purity culture, I think the abstinence education, all these things have kind of arisen, and the way that we define sex is really just in response to what the culture is doing. The culture has said sex is between two consenting adults that just want to have a good time, and so we respond by saying
more. And even non-consenting now, I would say we're moving towards that.
That's very true. I would say, though, then what's happened within a lot of the context of the conversations in the church have really just been a response to what the culture is doing. So we put rules and regulations around it rather than radically looking at what Scripture, the biblical script is, which is one of unity, unifying, oneness. That Genesis 2:23-25 are speaking to that.
Right.
The dynamic of us being made in the image of God. And so I think that our response to these things is really important, but we can't do that unless we have a really good understanding of what the culture is telling us.
Right, and your kids do have a pretty good understanding. They haven't sorted it out, but the latest research from Common Sense Media, which came out a couple of months ago, December of 2015, says that average daily media use among 13 to 18-year-olds is 9 hours a day. That does not include time spent using media for school or for homework. And for our 8 to 12-year-olds, they're spending just under 6 hours a day. So we know that it's shaping kids, and they're getting the message, so we need to get the message out. And the basic point here is use the media as a springboard, as a talking point, as a teachable moment. And then we need to talk about, as you've said, this Christian sexual ethic. And we're going to take a little break here. When we come back, we'll look at the last 2 non-negotiables of these 5 non-negotiables. And they really are all about this Christian sexual ethic. So let's take a break, and we'll be right back. In an effort to help you help the kids you know and love navigate their emerging sexuality to the glory of God, we've launched a sexual integrity initiative here at CPYU. Thanks to a generous grant from a company called DAS, you can access our sexual integrity initiative and a growing number of resources for free by visiting the website at sexualintegrityinitiative.com. Welcome back to this first episode of Youth Culture Matters. I'm Walt Mueller here at CPYU, and Jason Soshenik is with us today. We're talking in this segment about 5 non-negotiables when it comes to talking to kids about sex and sexuality. And we've already talked about the first 3. Number 1, starting with what God is for, not against. Secondly, choosing our words carefully. We unpacked a little bit about talking about sexuality in terms of sexual integrity as opposed to using the term sexual purity. And then lastly, number 3, we talked about using the teachable moments that the media gives us when the media talks about sexuality, and then working to debunk with Scripture the lies that the media tells us about sexuality when that happens, and it happens quite a bit. So, Jason, in this segment, we want to finish up with a little bit on a Christian sexual ethic, and one of the terms that you've used is you talk about God as being the sex maker, which, when I open a Bible dictionary and I look for the names of God, that's not one that's in there. So talk about why you use that and the importance of using that term, the sex maker.
Well, I think it's just simply remembering who made sex. I think that so often, because we don't talk about it, we're unsure. And one of the things that we find in Scripture, specifically when it comes to the first command that's given in Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis, is to be fruitful and to multiply. And you don't do that by some harmless mode of vegetation. You do that through sex. And I think that that's really important, that command in and of itself, because it recognizes that God was the one that invented sex. He was the one that gave us sex. He was the one that made sex. And I always joke that it wasn't God up in heaven and looking down on Adam and Eve and like, what are you doing behind that bush? There was a wonderful and significant event that occurred, and sex was a part of that. And he was the one that created this great gift. And so I think that when we talk about sex, we have to recognize first and foremost who created it.
Right. And then what we want to do is go to this 4th non-negotiable, which is what did he create it for? And this is where, it's liberating, I think, for people to hear about what the purposes of sex are. And I think that in our sex education, whether we're parents or youth workers, whoever it is, we are talking to kids about sex. Talk first that sex originates with God. It was there at creation. It's part of our human flourishing. God declared it, as you said, as very good, along with all other things. The problem is that in our post-Genesis 3:6 fallen world, we forget what sex is for and we abuse it. But there are really 4 purposes for sex, and that's our 4th non-negotiable, the purpose or the purposes of sex. Dennis Hollinger, who is a friend and the president of Gordon Conwell Seminary, has written a tremendous book called The Meaning of Sex. And in there, he basically states and unpacks, and by the way, this is a great book for youth workers and parents to read to give you content for your sex education, for how to talk about this with kids. It's very accessible, very helpful. He says there are 4 purposes of sex as we see it in the Scriptures. One, of course, is to consummate a marriage, that 2 become, as you said, one flesh. Intercourse, the act of sexual intercourse, completes the marriage, and we really get that out of order in our culture today. I remember as a kid, we'd have this little chant, so-and-so and so-and-so sitting in a tree, K-I-S-S-I-N-G. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in a baby carriage. I mean, that was older people will remember that. when you wanted to put a dig into somebody, in very elementary, childish ways, we would chant that little thing, and that got it right. And the order was right there, okay? I mean, you're laughing because you think it's so old-fashioned, but older folks will remember that. And we get that totally out of whack now. Love and marriage come later. So the first purpose is consummation of a marriage. Secondly, Hollinger says it's procreation. God says to us, be fruitful and multiply. This is, as you've said, Jason, how we have children. Third is to foster love and intimacy. It's a gift given to us by God where a husband and a wife in the context of a covenantal marriage come together, and it's the most intimate, physical, expressive way for two people, a husband and a wife, to say to each other, I love you. And that's a beautiful thing. And then the fourth purpose is pleasure, which I think there have been periods in history and in church history where people saw sexuality as being something that you do just to have kids. It's like a duty. And the reality is that this is a way for us to experience pleasure with each other. And so we have to remember that. Consummation of marriage, procreation, love and intimacy, and pleasure, the four purposes of sex.
Yeah, I think that each of those is incredibly vital as we dive into the conversation. So often we forget about the purposes around it, and we'll get to this here in a moment, but I would even add protection, the aspect and wonderful dynamic of marriage, that there is a time and a place where sex is practiced. But I think that we, especially with regards to pleasure, are afraid to mention that as one of the purposes of sex. And we have to, you don't have to go any further than the first chapter of Genesis to realize that God is a God of pleasure, and that sex is a part of the way in which he wants us to enjoy the world in which he's created. And that is not often discussed. It's really interesting when I ask teens, what is the one reason why you might want to have sex? Well, the first thing that they think is not the first thing they say. It's the last thing, which is it feels good. I always joke with them, it's not like you've heard that it feels like getting hit over the head with a bat, right? Like there is something, pleasure, that is attached to this one topic, this one activity, sex. And so we have to find ways to engage each of these. Procreation, it creates life, it's powerful. Pleasure, it's something that we're to enjoy. Intimacy, it's about closeness, being known, being understood. These are all really important things.
Yeah, now the question is, where? And you mentioned that right at the outset there after we mentioned, that we're talking about the purposes of sex as a non-negotiable protection in place within marriage. And this is where we move to the fifth non-negotiable, and that is where we establish for our kids, according to God's grand and wonderful order and design for his wonderful gift of sexuality, that there is a place for sex. And unfortunately in our culture, the place now is everywhere, and we're losing our sacred understanding of sexuality, and our sexuality really takes us to dark places rather than to the right place in terms of growing closer in our relationship with our husband or our wife, or also to God. But John Stott, who's one of my favorite theologians, and I was reading this the other day, he unpacks this and talks about the place for sex. When you go to Genesis 2:24, this is really where we see it. And just to remind people, this is where in the creation before the fall, God says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Or the two in some translations will become one flesh. And we typically hear that at a wedding ceremony, and that's not by accident, because it's talking about marriage as the place for sex. And marriage, as Stott says, is a relationship with 5 facets, which, by the way, Jesus affirms Genesis 2:24 in Mark 10:7. And I'm sure he affirmed it elsewhere as well in his earthly ministry. But here's what Stott says. There's 5 aspects to this place for sex. One is it's a heterosexual marriage, a man or a husband and a woman and a wife. So it's man and woman together. Secondly, it's monogamous, one man and one woman. And this is certainly something we need to remember and stress in today's world where polyamory is being promoted. I've read a lot about that lately, and people are embracing that as a lifestyle. Poly, meaning many, amorous or amor, meaning love or lovers, and this is weird, Jason. This polyamory, it's like a husband and a wife, but they agree that they will both take many lovers, and that's really not monogamy. So you've got heterosexual, one, number two, monogamous, number three, it's committed. So there is this cleaving. A man will leave his parents and cleave to or hold fast to. And this is a pushback on cohabitation, because what's missing in cohabitation, which is off the charts in our culture, is the commitment. Fourth, it is public. It is a public marriage where the leaving of parents is a social occasion. This is why we have a wedding with, we exchange vows before God and these witnesses. And then lastly, number five, it is physical. And the scriptures say here clearly in Genesis 2:24, the last two words are one flesh. So it's that aspect of consummation. So this is the place for sex, and we need to talk about this, these five facets of marriage. That biblical sexuality, this is the place for it.
Yeah, and I think that you end with one flesh, and I think what I'll do is I'll just pick up from that, because those two words together, ichad and basar, are this wonderful coming together, this fusing of two individuals. That's really what sex is. It's the fusing together. It's oneness. It's unity. And where does that take place? It's to take place in marriage, where you can fully be you can fully be known, fully be understood. And I think that one of the things that we have to be able to come back to that you mentioned is, you mentioned Mark, where Jesus brings back up Genesis 2. Well, Jesus is not quiet on this subject, and I think that that's really important. Matthew 5, Matthew 15, Matthew 19, all of them have references where Jesus is engaging in the culture and actually giving a sexual ethic, both affirming what's in the past, but also adding his own language. A perfect example is in Matthew 19, 4 through 6, where Jesus is responding to the Pharisees and is actually not just laying out God's intent, but even given his own words. He goes back to Genesis 1:27, made them male and female. He affirms Genesis 2:24, where it talks about the two becoming one flesh. And then he adds his own words and actually says, therefore what God has brought together, let no man separate. We often miss this ingredient. There are many churches and there are many places that are afraid to engage or forget that Jesus actually spoke about sex. And it's not that he didn't speak about sex. He might not have spoken about it a lot, but when he did, it was really important. And he adds a lot of his own language, or I might even be as brave to say his own heart, into the conversation. And marriage is that place. Marriage is the place where sex is to take place. And so he's affirming a historical sexual ethic that they had up until his life, and then death, resurrection, and even afterwards, where the Apostle Paul speaks often about that. And what does Paul do? He actually affirms what's back in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And so I think understanding that marriage is this place where sex is to take place, and that Jesus, that Paul, these are not individuals that were quiet on this subject. There are large portions of Scripture that speak about this and continue to affirm marriage being the place where sex is to occur. Yeah.
So this is a good discussion, and our basic message here is that we need to talk about sex and sexuality because it's a part of life. It's a God-given gift, and certainly the culture is talking about sex and sexuality 24/7 and shaping, or we might say misshaping, the understanding that it's children, teens, and adults have about this. And so we need to rewrite or correct the cultural script with the truths of God's Word. So this little conversation today, it's not been exhaustive. We've talked about non-negotiables when it comes to talking to kids about sexuality. We've mentioned 5. And just a review, start with what God is for, not against. God's big yes for sexuality. He made it. Number 2, choosing our words carefully. And we talked about couching our conversations in a framework of sexual integrity as opposed to sexual purity. Although purity is not a bad word. And then 3, debunking media's lies, coming at and pushing back on the messages that the media is sending that are not good, true, right, and honorable, that misshape sex. Number 4, we need to talk about the purposes of sex according to a Christian sexual ethic, and then picking up on that, number 5, talking about the place for sex. So we really hope this is helpful, and we don't want the conversation to end here. We're going to be coming back on future podcasts and talking about certain aspects of this with greater depth and some of the nuanced issues that are coming out in our culture relating to love, sex, and marriage. There's certainly a lot of that. But one of the things we want to do is use these podcasts as a springboard for people to learn more. This is not an end-all, be-all. And so we have actually set up on the podcast page a list of resources. Anything that we've talked about here already, we're going to link to make it easy for you, those of you who are listening, to access those things. But one thing I do want to do, Jason, before we end, is just offer up some recommendations on some books. What are some books that have been helpful to you? What are some books that have been helpful to me that we want to encourage parents and youth workers to access? And go ahead and give me some of what you've come up with.
There's 2 that stand out to me, and one has been it's 10 years old, but it's still really relevant. It's Real Sex by Lauren Winner. And the thing that she does so well, she talks about the 10 lies the church tells us and the 10 lies the culture tells us. Those 2 chapters in and of themselves are really important, I think, for practitioners and for parents to be able to read. And even though it might have been written 10, 12 years ago, it's still valid. The points that are made are still really important. The second book is one that you and I have talked a lot about, which is The Meaning of Sex by Dennis Hollinger. And it's a wonderful, we actually brought it up here in the podcast with regards to some of the purposes that we find around sex. And I think that this does a wonderful job of diving deeply into Scripture, giving deep thought to the conversations around sex and sexuality. So those would be the 2 that I would recommend. What about you?
Well, I've got 2, and if you, it's hard to believe. I mean, I have 2 to 3 shelves in my office lined with books about sex. I never imagined that would be part of my adult life. But 2 that I'll mention here that are really helpful. One is a book that we've recommended here at CPYU for years. It's by Mindy Meyer. It's called Sex and Dating, subtitled Questions You Wish You Had Answers To. Mindy has worked for years with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at a university in the Chicago area, and her work with college students has been specifically with students in fraternities and sororities, and we know that there's a sexual culture there that's evolved over the years. And so what she's done is she's written down probably about 35 of the questions that she's heard the most over all her years in working with students, and then framed biblical answers. Here's the value of this book. One is, not only is it faithful to the Scriptures and God's order and design for sexuality, that Christian sexual ethic, but she gives us the questions she's heard. So, for parents, even of younger children, it's good to read those questions, because now you know what the questions are that your kids, if they don't have them yet, they will have. So you want to start to frame answers now. And then her answers are framed so well that will give you some content. So Sex and Dating by Mindy Meyer. The second book is one I mentioned earlier that I'm still not finished with, but I think it's excellent. And this book's getting a lot of attention right now. It's fairly new. It's called Divine Sex, subtitled A Compelling Vision for Christian Relationships in a Hypersexualized Age, written by Jonathan Grant. It's published by Brazos Press out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I'll just say this, that I would really push youth workers who want to be thoughtful towards this book, because you're going to have to work through it. But basically what he's doing is he's unpacking a lot of the cultural shifts that have contributed to the shifts in the way that we look at and we view and we act on our sexuality. So those are 2 really, really good books. Let me just mention that any of the printed resources that we mention on these podcasts, they will be available to you, and either through our CPYU Resource Center, and we will put links to these books up. If we have the book here, you can link to it there. Any books you purchase through us go to support our ministry. But I'm especially excited to develop a deeper relationship with one of my best friends in ministry for years now, almost 40 years, Byron Borger, who runs the Hearts and Minds bookstore in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, a wonderful independent bookstore that is all about equipping Christians to think Christianly. This is not your typical bookstore, and it's an independent bookstore. We want to support Byron. Byron has graciously said that if you click on any of the links for any of these books and it takes you to the Hearts and Minds website, you can order the book from them and use the discount code CPYU. The discount code will be just CPYU, the initials for the Center for Parent Youth Understanding, and you will get 20% off most resources and books that you order through them. So we're happy to talk about, to launch that relationship and pass that on to you and introduce you to someone who's been especially important to us. Well, Jason, this has been good. I'm glad we're doing this. I'm excited about what the future holds, and I look forward to our next podcast. Any parting words you have for folks before we sign off here?
Well, stay tuned. We've got a lot more to cover in the several episodes ahead, and so I'm really excited for what those conversations will look like, and really excited about the time that you and I get to be able to share diving into these conversations.
Right, and it's going to be broad. It's going to be diverse in terms of the topics we hit, and you'll hear more on how to contact us and let us know what kinds of things you'd like us to talk about. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you next time we get together for this podcast from CPYU.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.